Good afternoon. My name is John Weingart, and I'm the Associate Director of the Eagleton Institute of Politics at Rutgers University. It's my pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to the Holland program on ethics and government session, convened as a collaboration between the League of Municipalities and the Eagleton Institute for a number of years now. This year's topic is exercising political courage. We have three distinguished people who will be discussing that. And before I introduce them, I want to tell you a little bit about the man for whom this event is named. Art Holland was the mayor of Trenton for almost 30 years. First elected in 1959, he became well known for his openness to the public and for the ethical standards of his administration. Holland was a Rutgers alum, graduate of the class of 1954, and also a graduate student. In 1989, shortly after his death, Rutgers established the Arthur J. Holland Program in Ethics in Government to remember Mayor Holland and to help build from his legacy. And this annual session at the League Conference has long been a major component of that program. Consistent with his life and with the mission of the Eagleton Institute of Politics, the Holland Program on Ethics in Government seeks to promote integrity in public affairs and to improve public policy and government practices by seeking ways to replace cynicism and apathy with awareness, understanding, and action. And we have our work cut out for us. For the Eagleton Institute, overseeing the Holland Program has special resonance because two members of the Holland family are graduates of the Eagleton Fellowship Program. Art's wife, Betty Holland, was in the first class of Eagleton Fellows in 1958, and their son, Matt, was an Eagleton Fellow in 1994. And today, many in the family, including Betty, remain keen observers of and advisors to Eagleton. The Arthur J. Holland Program seeks to promote ethics in government, a phrase which can be defined in many ways. We mean it as men and women in government making decisions because they believe the policies and actions they choose are for the greater good, and not because of any personal gain or advantage they and their associates might receive. Lieutenant Governor, welcome. I'll introduce you and the other panelists in a moment, but you're muted, I believe. Your microphone is muted.
Gotcha.
Okay. I want to tell you just, welcome. I want to tell you just one illustrative story about Mayor Holland that I learned a few years ago from two of the Holland children. When they were young, they were significant baseball fans, and living in Trenton, that meant they were fans of the Phillies. Over dinner one night, their dad told them that he had just been offered season tickets to the Phillies and that he had turned them down. The two boys were both upset and couldn't believe their dad had done this. But Art Holland then said to his sons, well, if I wasn't mayor, would they have offered me the tickets? And they had to reply, the answer was no. And Art Holland said, well, that was all he needed to know to be certain that he should not accept the tickets. The panel we have assembled here this afternoon includes Sheila Oliver, the Lieutenant Governor of New Jersey and the Commissioner of the Department of Community Affairs, Jonathan Holloway, the President of Rutgers University, and John Farmer, former New Jersey Attorney General and current Director of the Eagleton Institute of Politics. Now it's my pleasure to turn this over to John Farmer.
John, and welcome everybody. Just a quick note of a personal connection to the Holland family that Betty Holland brought to my attention. In the 1960s, at a particularly turbulent time in Trenton's history, Mayor Holland and his family moved into a predominantly African-American neighborhood, which caused quite a stir. And there was a young reporter who had recently transferred down from covering the Jersey City Police Beat to the State House in Trenton, who covered that story, and the story went national. It was in Life magazine, and it was that young reporter's first sort of big national story, and that was my dad. So New Jersey is a very small place, as we all know, and President Holloway is finding out, I guess. The idea for today's session really came from really the crucible of the summer and the spring, with the shutdown orders and the sort of close quarters in which we were all forced to live, and the social isolation that gave way to social justice protests in the wake of the murder of George Floyd in the summer. It struck me that our era of politics is going to require a lot of its leaders at every level, from municipal officials to first responders, to academic leaders, to policymakers at the highest levels of government. Mayors and other municipal officials live the reality every day that there's nowhere to hide. They have to make tough decisions in a very difficult environment, and that's only been exacerbated by the events of this year with the COVID epidemic. And it struck me that sort of above all, what our time is going to require at every level of leadership is political courage. The willingness to make difficult decisions that may be unpopular and that may cut against sort of the way the winds are blowing. And it's a very rare quality in my experience, political courage. So what we're here to talk about today is exactly what does it mean for our time, the idea of political courage. How do you make the hard calls? What's the thinking process that's involved? And we're really honored today to have with us to discuss this topic, Lieutenant Governor Oliver and President Holloway. Give you a little more detail. Sheila Oliver was born and raised in Newark, New Jersey, self-described Jersey girl, according to her department's website. Graduated from Wequahic High School with honors from Lincoln University and received her master's from Columbia University. She's experienced at every level of government. She served as a member of the East Orange Board of Education and the Essex County Board of Chosen Freeholders. She was elected in 2003 to the General Assembly and rose quickly to become the Speaker of that Assembly as the first African-American woman to serve as the Speaker and just the second in the nation to lead a state legislative house. She currently serves as the Commissioner of the Department of Community Affairs, and all of you in the audience are familiar with her from her role as Commissioner of Community Affairs, where she really oversees local government services and has done a lot to enhance opportunity zones, urban enterprise zones, neighborhood revitalization programs, and other programs that are so important to municipal officials. President Jonathan Holloway became the 21st president of Rutgers on July 1st, 2020. Very good timing, just as the pandemic was hitting. Prior to becoming Rutgers president, he served as the provost of Northwestern University from 2017 to 2020. From 1999 to 2017, he was a member of the faculty at Yale University, where he also served as the dean of Yale College and the Edmund Morgan Professor of African American Studies, History, and American Studies. He serves on the boards of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, the Andrew Mellon Foundation, and the Academic Leadership Institute. He has written 3 books, Confronting the Veil, Jim Crow Wisdom, Memory and Identity in Black America since 1940, and the forthcoming The Cause of Freedom, A Concise History of African Americans, which you can pre-order. I guess the publication date is in February, but you can pre-order it on Amazon, and we all look forward to reading it. I thought we'd start by sort of giving each of you an opportunity to talk about your own perspective on political courage and everything from idols you had growing up, either in your personal life or historical, or really any observations you want to make about the subject of political courage, and then we'll get more specific about our time. So Lieutenant Governor Oliver, you want to go first?
Thank you, John and President Holloway. It's good to be here with you to discuss this. As John Farmer was describing political courage, and as John Weingart gave us an anecdote about Holland, I began to think, when did I embrace this issue of political courage? And then I want to touch on ethics and ethics in the political system. I'm a baby boomer, so I grew up in what I call the golden age, right before we had the whole social pendulum swing over to another side. And I think that the era of time that I was born in, it was a kinder and gentler time. I think that as a young person, I was an avid reader. And, I went to Sunday school, but I think early in my life, I developed this keen sense of what's right and what's wrong, and speaking up when something is wrong, when you know it's right. I really believe that began for me at a very early age. When I, got into the late 60s and the early 70s, that is when you began to see turbulence all over the country. People were examining social mores and values. And I have always believed that each one of us has a core sense of values. And for me, it has always been being an ethical person. Spending the bulk of my career working in the public sector and working in higher ed, I've come to learn through the years, based on my own experience and my own observations, that unfortunately, there is not a lot of, quote, political courage that exists. And when I became the Speaker of the General Assembly, one of the top aides that I worked with very closely said to me early on, as I began to challenge the status and just the environment of the State House, he said something to me that I've never forgotten. And he said, "Speaker, you're not going to find too many red badges of courage in this place." And everyone, I was stunned by it, because I learned very quickly in my own caucus before I became Speaker that I would be the only person in my caucus room to raise my hand and to speak about bills that we were going to vote on. This is when I was a neophyte assembly person. And I did not know that the protocol that existed was that anything that the speaker or the leadership put up, you weren't to question it and you were to go with the flow. Well, I'm not a go with the flow kind of a person. I'm an inquisitive person. I want to know the facts. I'm a critical and analytical thinker. Quite frankly, I hate to say, that does not exist in our political system and in our governing bodies to a degree. I remember as a member of the Board of Education, we had a very hardworking person, and he was deserving of a promotion. So I chaired the Personnel Committee, and we voted to promote this gentleman. Subsequently, the next time we came back for a meeting, when I came to sit at my place on the podium, there was a gift wrapped box. And one of my other colleagues that was on that committee with me had that same box at her seat as well. When I opened the box, there was a watch inside, and there was a note to me saying thank you. After the meeting, I immediately called the employee, and I said to him, "You don't owe me anything. You earned a promotion," and I returned the watch to him. My colleague 2 seats away kept that watch. And that is when I began to see that, in our governing bodies, in our public bodies, there were members who we thought should adhere to the highest ethical standards, did not always do that. Of course, as I have now become Lieutenant Governor and the Commissioner of a department, I have an even keener sense of the issue of operating in the sphere of highest ethical standard. I don't have to tell you that in government, as a legislator, or I spent 20 years as an assistant county administrator in Essex County, people are always going to try to entice you, thinking they'll get that contract, or that person, they want to have a job and they want you to do that. You're always going to be tested in that way. When the county executive of Essex assumed office, and that's the year I came in to the office of assistant county administrator, he hired an ex-FBI person to be the inspector general for the county. He was terrified because two previous county executives had been indicted and served federal sentences. And there is a tradition among county execs, maybe presidents as well, but you leave something on the desk for the person who's coming in. And the last person that held his office left a skeleton on his desk. And he was terrified, didn't even want to stay in that office. But that shows you the extreme pressure that people who serve in a very public fashion are confronted with. But in our state government, we do not receive fruit baskets, wine baskets, any form of gift. We immediately contact the head of our governmental ethics office, and we donate all of those things to nonprofit organizations. And I believe that's the way it should be. In terms of this political courage, and when you are asked to go with the flow and just accept things the way they're going to be, I think that an ethical public servant must always speak up and speak out about them. In a time gone by, I used to say, well, what can they do? Shoot me? But these days, I guess that could be a possibility. But I have never wavered from being that type of a public servant. I think obviously it has boded well for me because I have survived working in the public sector. And as John said, I have had the opportunity to grow through the ranks. I think that if you exert that type of leadership, you develop a great deal of respect from the people that you are working with. And I believe that your constituencies have that much more respect for you.
Thank you. President Holloway, you're a eminent historian as well as president of Rutgers. So could you give us some reflections on political courage from an historical perspective as well as your own personal story?
Sure. Thank you. And the joy of following Lieutenant Governor, well, there's not much joy in that. I mean, that was very impressive. Thank you. But I do have a different perspective from the story that I'll tell, having been operating in the private sphere in higher education, private universities, until moving to Rutgers this July. And the story I'm about to tell is from 2015, 2016, which for me is really, well, from my experience, is the beginning of the social movement that we're now living in now, in terms of Black Lives Matter bursting onto our national consciousness for all kinds of reasons. So I was working at Yale at this time, and I was Dean of Yale College, in charge of all aspects of the undergraduate experience. And we were having quite a year, is the polite way of putting it. Lots of controversies on campus. And in the spring semester, there was a controversy over the naming of buildings on campus and the opening up of 2 new residential colleges, the first ones at Yale in 50 years. And the names had just been announced, and students were furious with the decision. I won't get into the deeper details, it's immaterial. In any event, the president, my boss, in this way quite different from Lieutenant Governor's, being already an elected official and having her own constituency, I served at the pleasure of my boss. So it was very hierarchical, and appropriately so. And we were both in a large gathering space, a chapel on the campus, about 1,200 students. A fifth of Yale's undergraduate student body was present. The place was full. So this is a very electrified moment. And students expressed their anger with the decision that had been communicated. And at the end of this very difficult hour, people were leaving, and a number of students, about a dozen, were gathered around the president and asking him politely but really pointed questions. And I was to the side, my job being there to be supportive, but it's his show, he's the president. So I'm just standing there, and a student came up to me with whom I had a very strong relationship. This is a very friendly exchange, but pointed also. He said he was taking a class on principled leadership Stanley McChrystal, the retired general. And we'll call the student Jeff. And so Jeff is taking this class on principled leadership, and that General McChrystal been talking about the need for people to speak up when they feel something wrong has happened, which is the theme of this session. And I'm like, yes, I understand. He goes, well, you know, I think you're a campus leader. What do you think of this? What do you think of that idea? I'm like, well, if you believe that, well, I said the first thing to know is that my job as dean is to support the president. That is literally my job. And that the president's opinion is the only opinion that matters right now. And I think that's appropriate given the nature of this structure. Said, however, let's presume that I felt very differently than the president did on this decision. And he said, yes, what would you do? I'm like, well, okay, a principled leader then would, he was saying a principled leader has to stand up and make a statement. I'm like, I understand that. And I said, and do you know what happens at the end of that statement? What the final sentence is? He goes, no. So the final sentence is, I hereby resign. Because you have to take the principled stand. You cannot stand for this injustice. And I said, so think about this though. Let's presume I disagreed with the president so strongly that I felt the need to take that stand. My last sentence, I think from a principled position, would be I have to resign the deanship. And I want to tell you, Jeff, I'm not ready to resign the deanship over this issue. I don't think this issue is big enough because there's so many other things that need to be done. So in that moment, and he was sort of mulling it over. I'm like, think about the things that you care about. You know how I think, you know what I think of these things. If I'm not there for the things you care about, Jeff, who else in the administration is going to fight for you? And he goes, yeah, that's true. There's nobody else. I'm like, that's right. So there's a way in which being a principled leader, I wanted to add a nuance to it, is that you need to figure out if the stakes are high enough, if the moment demands enough for you, that you withdraw from that conversation permanently. That would be the end of my administrative career anywhere, probably. And so sometimes I feel being that principal leader is to figure out, okay, how do I navigate this moment so I can continue to fight from a position of power or influence, let's say, when I think we have a real crisis coming down the line. And that's a judgment call. It's very difficult. So for me, that was a very complicated moment because given the material that I was teaching as a professor, which was related to this naming controversy, I had to figure out the difference between Professor Holloway and Dean Holloway, which were two different kinds of individuals facing a larger public. And that was not a pleasant process to navigate. I mean, it's one of these things, I know the Lieutenant Governor understands this, and certainly any higher ed administrator understands this. You're often faced with decisions where there is no good result. No matter what you decide, you've wronged somebody. And you have to navigate how you move forward in an ethical sense, in a principled sense, so that you can keep doing your job. And that was one of these early moments. It pales in comparison to the kinds of things the Lieutenant Governor has experienced, I know. But in my young administrative career, it was a moment of crisis, trying to figure out how I could move forward and still serve individuals. Now, the other, two very quick things. This, you asked earlier about people that I admire, and I've thought about that a fair amount, and the list is either way too long or way too short. And, one could admire political leaders or activist leaders and such, but I actually admire the people whose names we don't know. The people who, for instance, when Martin Luther King came into town, which is a moment of crisis, when he left, the people who were left behind were in a much more dangerous moment. And yet they still kept up that political movement. So it's the people whose names I don't know who are fighting for, securing a more just moment are the ones who I admire enormously. And these are often the people who don't have much power or much privilege, but they get up and go to work every day and try to do their best. And if something goes wrong, they raise their voice in the way that they can, often at great risk, and are not heralded in history. Those people are completely astonishing to me. And I know that I would not be where I am had it not been for so many other people who are working hard to imagine a day where Rutgers might be ready to have the first Black president in its history. So those are the people I admire and wish I knew how to thank.
Lieutenant Governor Oliver, your bio notes that that you viewed a Tale of Two Cities as a turning point for you. You want to elaborate on that? How did that affect you, and what did you mean by that?
Yes, as a 13-year-old, I was enrolled in an honors English class, and we read all the great classics. When we got to A Tale of Two Cities, it was a book that I could not put down. Looking back retrospectively, I know that, it was defining in very separate ways, classism and privilege. And of course, I developed a keen sense at 8th grade that there were a group of people who were being wronged, the people who had no bread, the people who were being thrown in prison without any justice or fairness. And at that time, I gained a real strong sense that this was wrong and people should not be subjected to that. Obviously, it had a great deal of influence on me because in most of my professional life, I have always been, and I've always felt compelled to speak for the people who can't speak for themselves, and to make certain that opportunity is extended to everyone and that everyone is able to live a good quality of life. Dr. Holloway, as he talked about people who influenced him, anyone that knows me knows that it was the late Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm that had a profound influence on me. Here's this woman born in the Caribbean, parents coming to the United States. During a period of time, women weren't expected to go to college. She goes to college, she graduates with a business degree, but she's got 2 strikes against her. She's Black and she's a female. She ends up working in the educational sphere, but begins to go to community meetings where she too begins to speak for people who can't speak for themselves. She goes into a local elected office, and then she ends up being the first Black woman in Congress. Following her career, because our borders are so close, I always kept up with what was going on in New York. I thought this was just a phenomenal, phenomenal person who had the ability to swim upstream when the current was going a different way. There is no doubt that she had a profound impact on the person I became professionally.
President Holloway, you mentioned the incident at Yale. It was sort of at the very beginning of what now has blossomed into the Black Lives Matter movement. And I'm wondering, how much of our history, and particularly with respect to political courage, should be reconsidered in light of our current state of things. And the example that comes to my mind was over the summer, I revisited, some classes about political courage, Profiles in Courage by John Kennedy and Hard Calls by Senator McCain. And it just struck me in Profiles in Courage, one of the people that future President Kennedy celebrated was a former high-ranking Confederate officer and future US Senator Lucius Lamar, who had actually drafted the Ordinance of Secession for Mississippi. And he celebrated his role in ending what he referred to as the carpetbag Republican rule in Mississippi. And that's the perspective from 1950s America. But now that reversal is considered really the beginnings of Jim Crow and the Black codes that were passed. And so how should we think of such historical figures in light of our sort of current situation? It's
a great question. When not all of my answers will be about Yale, but it's it speaks to what we were dealing with at that particular time, with buildings that were named for slave owners, and in one case, an architect for secession, although not the author of it, John C. Calhoun. And when we eventually got around to having a Blue Ribbon Commission to address naming practices at Yale, one of the very first things the chair of that commission said, which I've never forgotten, is that we need to bring humility to our understanding of the past. It is very easy for all of us in our present day to say, well, I would have never done X, Y, or Z at a particular moment in time. I would have never allowed people to make certain declarations or treat people in a certain way. And, maybe you wouldn't have, 50 years earlier. However, we need to think about this moment when we have figured everything out. That's what people in the present think often. But I promise you, and he was saying this, in 20 or 30 years, people are going to be saying, you drove your cars? You ate meat? So this sort of like, there's this presentist notion of we've got it figured out. And the fact is we just don't. We're doing hopefully the best we can. And I fear that we're in a moment of just deep dissemblance where people know they're not doing the best that they can and yet are still pressing forward, making claims that I think really are shaking the Republic in very concerning ways. I think if you think about, the example you gave from Kennedy's Profiles in Courage, nothing about it smells right at all. It makes you wonder, like, well, what was the what was he doing? He's a political operator. What was he doing in trying to make those claims? I have my immediate theories, won't bother going into it, but the fact is, history does not treat anybody very kindly if it's good history. A good history says, okay, that person may have tried, but he or she was overlooking entire populations of people, or that person was overlooking, the terrible things that the person they're lionizing did. History is a good history is relentless. But I think that's why it's critical we have good histories. When we think of this country, I was thinking before you turn to Profiles in Courage, Hannah Nicole Jones's 1619 product, the New York Times Magazine, where she put forward a sort of a thought piece of a whole new way of thinking about US history, 1619 being the moment, the historicized moment. It's actually not, it's a useful date. It's not the most accurate date of when Africans showed up in what becomes the United States. And these were enslaved people. And it was this sort of, I found it a revelation, but there was a huge pushback from historians, other historians, or professional historians saying, she got 15 different things wrong. And she said, I've never claimed to be a historian, although I talked to historians about this, but they missed the entire point of her project because they were, to my reading, felt that she was threatening the country's history by being critical of it, by being critical of founding fathers, different ideas. And that misses the entire point. A good history says, of the United States in this case, we are a very complicated country with lots of different histories, and yet somehow we have maintained ourselves as an entity. Somehow we have held together. And there's something important in that fact that we've held together through atrocities. We've held together. So I think the history of this country is even more exceptional when we think about those unsightly parts of our history, because there's still something that we're aiming towards, that we're believing, and that we want to see realized. So when I see people pushing back, we need to have a 1776 project, I'm like, my God, we don't need more mythology. We need tough, fair histories that challenge us, because in that challenging, we are a better place. And that's what I worry about, that people want these shortcuts and they're not eager to, willing to, or understand the value of being challenged. That's where you get better.
Lieutenant Governor Oliver, you made some news over the summer by responding to the Defund the Police movement, by sort of rejecting out of hand the idea of completely defunding the police. What went into that decision by you to come out publicly on that subject?
Well, I think that, as we watched what was erupting all over the country and this issue that, police organizations were at the very depths of the status of people of color in this country, I rejected that. And we know that public safety and law enforcement agencies serve a purpose. Now, is there police brutality? Yeah, there is police brutality. Has the power and authority of law enforcement been used for an illicit purpose through our history? Yes, it has. But we cannot define all police officers, all police organizations, and paint them with a brush that we need to just abolish them. That just cannot happen. And I'm glad that Dr. Holloway began to talk, and you, John, through the context of history, because I think one of the things that is challenging us, particularly many of the young people that have formed the basis of that movement, is the fact that many of the participants have no historical context whatsoever in terms of some of the beliefs and positions that they are adopted. It is extremely important for us as Americans to understand the history of everyone in the United States. It is very important for us to understand we're the melting pot for a reason. One of the things I think that we're up against in this country is that, yes, we do love our exceptionalism, but we should not love our American exceptionalism to the extent that we do not learn and develop perspectives from other types of societies and cultures around the world. I think that that is what is harming us the most in the context of this culture. Everyone commented during the Black Lives Matters and the protests that went from one end of the country to the other. People were amazed at the recognition that they were not just Black and brown young people in this movement. There were people of all persuasions. Asian young people were participating, Native American Indian, Caucasian, Catholics, Muslims, across the board. And people were so amazed at that. But what I loved and embraced was everyone participated because everyone understood from within the lens that they live, they too had been subject, to some type of oppression or discrimination. But the issue of courage and political courage, we did not see that during these whole discussions of defund the police. And unfortunately, we saw elected officials and other leaders across the country fold into supporting that concept of defund the police because they felt it was politically expedient. It was a period of time where people were running for their congressional seats again. We have candidates, who were running for the highest office in the land. At the local level, if it was a predominantly Black or brown community, it was felt by leaders in the community that, they had to stand with the people that stood for defunding the police. I loved the public comment that the mayor of our largest city made, Ras Baraka in Newark. And when he was questioned, he said, defunding the police is a neoliberalism idea. And I think that, yes, it was a neoliberal idea. Anyone who has really taken a look at communities and social order knows that you absolutely have to have someone who is in charge of enforcing law and order. not brutality, but law and order. And that's what compelled me to speak out against that. And I know that many people in the law enforcement community took that very personally. They're out there, and I often say, people who are in public safety positions, they leave home every morning, they go out to do their job. Many of them don't know if they're going to return home at the end of the day. And I think that it was a disservice to attack the morale of people who do that job.
Yeah, the issue of defunding the police, an aspect of a larger problem, I guess, which is that the polarization of our country, to the point where it feels to me as if it takes courage to even say something at a family gathering when you know that certain people don't hold your opinions. I'm wondering, to what extent does just daily life now require political courage just to have conversations with folks? And what do you think is the long-term solution to that polarization? To either one of you or both.
If I may, I'll jump in with my modest thoughts first. I mean, these devices, these smartphones, have radicalized politics. They have done, and I mean that in good and bad ways. I mean, we see all the ways that they've brought people together and to change the country or to change societies in ways that are deeply needed. But my goodness, they have weaponized how we speak to one another. And what I would love to find is a way to tap into the organizing abilities of social media, and then to find a way to embrace decency again. And now, when I say embrace decency, I'm not saying look the other way because complaining is indecent. No, being active is an act of decency. I think quite often trying to try to improve things, but the notion of barriers and limits have been blown apart by hashtag politics, social media politics, and we now don't have the space to speak in error. We don't have the space to say, God, that's really not what I meant to say. I didn't, I'm sort of thinking on the fly here. And that's real detriment. I mean, I think we often forget at the end of the day that our public figures, our leaders or whatever, we are all human beings. And therefore we are deeply fallible and far from perfect. So I use the word grace a lot. And I think that we need to find a way to have that word, these frank kind of old fashioned words, I must say, grace, decency, believing in the possibility of redemption. All of these things need to be put back into our common good, into our common language. Because we are attacking ourselves at this point, and I think democracy is suffering.
Lieutenant Governor Oliver.
Yeah, I have always thought that it is as simple as placing yourself in the other person's shoes, and I think in this century we have lost the ability to do that. And Jonathan is absolutely right. Social media in general certainly has had a great deal of influence on that. But in terms of, being able to raise very sensitive issues amongst people with divergent views, maybe I'm idealistic, but I believe there is a way to do that. I think it has to be done having the ability to think from the other person's perspective, being able to engage in these kinds of conversations without it being combative, confrontational. And maybe we're in an era of time where we haven't allowed young people growing up into adults in our country to be able to exercise these kinds of communicative skills. I do believe that at the dinner table or at a social gathering within a family, there are people with divergent views. But I do believe we can, without getting into a huff where people get their coats and go home because they don't like the position a particular family member is espousing. There's a way to talk about these things. And I think both sides of a particular issue, if it is done properly and the communication is not being a danger to either's perspective or side, everyone walks away having learned something about that issue on either side. And that is what we have to get back to in this country. That's what we have to get back to in New Jersey. When you look at the tough issues that we're confronted with, not just as a country, but even within our state, we must begin to look through the lens of opposite sides. And it has a lot to do with the life experience that each one of us has had. That is what forms the opinions and the perspectives we have, the life experiences that we have had. I think that goes back to the Black Lives Matter movement. I am an African-American female. I have not had the same kind of experience with police that perhaps an African-American male has had. I know that there was a dentist in my community. He lived in New York and he commuted into New Jersey every day. And he had the most recent, fanciest BMW. And he told me how often he would get stopped. And he said it was because of the car that he drove. I think that many Black men have had that experience. To a lesser degree, Black women have not. But as a Black woman, it's incumbent upon me to understand that experience that Black men have had. I think if we could all look through the lens of someone else, we'd be a lot better off. I understand the way a white person feels if they are, walking through a community that they're not familiar with, and people are, standing on a corner. I'm thinking right now of members of my family. I have a niece and a nephew who were raised in a very suburban area in New Jersey. And when I would have them visit me in Essex County and we would travel through the county, they would ask me things like, Aunt Sheila, why are people standing on a corner like that? And I had to begin to provide them with the context of that experience and why people did stand outside, whereby they didn't do that in the community in which they lived. So it's complex, but at the root of it, it is really very simple.
Yeah, I want to turn to maybe the unique challenges that are posed by the current experience we're having with COVID-19. And I know it in retrospect seems like an easy decision to have made, but I remember distinctly at the end of June when the presidents of other Big Ten universities were announcing that they were going to be open, like Purdue and some other schools, and Notre Dame was announcing they were going to be fully open. President Holloway's literally first day on the job, he had to make the decision for Rutgers. And I'm wondering what went into that decision. And you had to know that at the time, and now it seems, now it's, no one's worried about it because it was clearly the right thing to do. But at the time, parents were going to be unhappy and alums were going to be unhappy and students were going to be unhappy. And so why didn't you go with the flow and say, we're going to try to be open and sort of hedge it that way, as opposed to just making the decision that you made?
Yeah, fun way to start. My very first press conference was sharing that news. It was actually an easy decision. I mean, a difficult circumstance, but an easy decision. We did not have the confidence that we could provide or guarantee the health and safety of the students, the faculty, and the staff. I mean, and all three components are critical. We know that, the younger you are, generally speaking, the virus is not going to affect you. The risk is lower. So students were upset. Well, why can't I be on campus? I'm like, I'm not worried. I mean, I couldn't say this in a literal sense, but I'm not worried about you really. I'm worried about the staff who are around you and the faculty have to teach you. We are all part of this community and we need to do it safely. So as you can imagine, I got a certain amount of email accusing me of playing politics with a virus, which is, I was doing exactly the opposite of that and feel that quite strongly. But it was tough to see other schools open up. Now, remember, I came from the Midwest before arriving in New Jersey. So I was reading the New York Times every day and seeing what was happening in the New York metropolitan area, just devastation. But I was not living it. And I know in Chicago, people were saying, wow, that's really bad. We're probably next, but it's not happening yet. So I understand the presidents in the Big Ten, which is largely Midwestern Conference Association. I understand they're saying, well, we can manage this because, you know, it's not here. Well, it's there. It's really there. And, you know, while we are going through a second wave right now, you know, it looks so much better in New Jersey than it does in other parts of the country. You all, I can't say I wasn't here. You went through it. You learned how to manage it. You learned all these different kind of practices that in these highly politicized environments in the Midwest through national elections and politics, you know, now governors are beginning to come around like maybe the mask was a good idea after all. I mean, this is about health and safety. This is really not any more complicated than that. So again, not a hard decision, but a very uncomfortable one. But again, that is my job. And I know the lieutenant governor, that's her job too, to be in that position and stand up.
Yeah, I think you said on a prior occasion that all the easy decisions are made 2 or 3 rungs below you on the ladder.
Yes.
So the only ones that filter up are the hard ones. Lieutenant Governor Oliver, what do you see as the continuing challenges of COVID-19 for you and the Governor Murphy, but also going all the way down to the municipal level for our audience today?
I think that going forward, I'm very concerned and know that in New Jersey, we're going to have to confront the economic reality in terms of what COVID-19 has done to the state and to families and individuals in New Jersey. There has been a significant loss of income for families, for businesses, and for local governments. I think that leaders in governments at every level, including higher education, are going to be confronted with some tough decisions going forward. There's not going to be enough resource to maintain institutions and institutional life as we've known it for quite a while. I think rebuilding the economy, there are jobs that people held. Those jobs are never going to return to New Jersey as a result of COVID-19. I think that a lot of pressure is going to be put on governmental leaders to begin to reconfigure the way their community operates and the service delivery and the way they do deliver services. I believe that we're going to have to do perhaps retraining of our workforce in New Jersey to inculcate new skills within people for the jobs that will be there in the future. Yesterday, I spent a great deal of my day down in Salem County and Gloucester County, and I visited Salem City, which has a 28% vacancy rate in terms of the real estate market. I traveled through blocks and blocks and blocks of empty stores, vacant houses, boarded up housing. How do we address a community like Salem City, which is considered to be the poorest city in our state? I think that's the challenge we're going to have going forward as a result of COVID-19.
Yeah, I mentioned we're about 5 minutes away from opening up the Q&A. I'd mentioned the difficult decision that President Holloway had to make with respect to Rutgers opening in the fall. And I wanted to sort of go back a few years now and talk about a difficult decision that you had to make as Speaker of the General Assembly and that really in which Rutgers' future, literally its future as a state university, was in the balance. And just to sort of remind everyone what was going on, there was a proposal because of perceived recalcitrance on the part of Rutgers Board of Trustees to pass legislation basically eliminating the Board of Trustees, and which has existed since 1766, and basically transforming Rutgers and eventually taking the Camden campus away and giving it to our own university. And it was a political fight, and to some extent, my own belief that Rutgers in some ways had it coming, because I think for a long time we took the state for granted and didn't see it as our greatest benefactor, but as an annoyance, even though they were giving us hundreds of millions of dollars a year. So this was payback going on. And this bill that had advanced, the governor had indicated he would sign it. The Rutgers Board of Trustees was prepared to meet to basically remove us from our status as a public university. And the Senate president indicated that they would have the votes in the Senate and the votes in the Assembly to pass that bill. And I was general counsel at Rutgers at the time, and my last resort was get to go to the Speaker of the General Assembly and literally beg her not to post this bill. And I wasn't sure what you were going to do, to be honest, when I left. I was driving back to New Brunswick, but I heard that you, at tremendous risk to your position, refused to post the bill. And I'm just wondering what went into that decision from your perspective. And I think, as in President Holloway's decision not to be remote this fall, in retrospect, it was obviously the right thing to do. But at the time, all the water was running again. The currents were all running against it, and you were the one who stood up. So I'm wondering what went into that call on your part.
I think being a Jersey girl, I had a great deal of familiarity with Rutgers University and its history. And I had known through the years many people who had served on the Board of Trustees. I recognized that the Board of Trustees was a great anchor governance body that worked in tandem with the Board of Governors. I knew that many were alums and other people who cared a lot about Rutgers and its educational mission. And I knew that they brought a great deal of resource to the university. Some of our best donors have come from within the ranks of the Board of Trustees at Rutgers. And the reasoning for eliminating it was so that there could be more political influence on who eventually came to serve on the Board of Governors, so that decisions could be influenced based on what people's political interests were. And that was just flat out wrong. I was very offended by efforts to pass that legislation. And I described to people that that's probably the best time I had in the General Assembly, going toe-to-toe with the Senate president on that issue. And many of our respective staffs were in the room at a particular meeting we were having. And, people often think that, women in leadership aren't going to be able to roll up their sleeves and go to the table and go to combat. But that's precisely what I had to do. And I've never regretted doing that. John, that was a great experience. I am so glad that we were able to preserve our Board of Trustees. That was the absolute right thing to do. But I also, you gave me a flashback of another hard decision I made as Speaker, and that was pension and benefit reform. People could not understand, of course, who were on the receiving end, that economics just weren't going to work for our state. We gave away through the decades extraordinary benefits, lifetime health care. And as we began to see escalating healthcare costs, as we began to see our pension funds, go up and down, I began to do a lot of reading, projecting that many of the pension funds in the public sector were not going to be able to sustain the people who were entitled to it. So I understood that we either had to make some corrections so that everyone would still be entitled to receive their health benefits and their pensions that they were promised. That just had to be done. And I remember coming to Trenton and the big rat was blown up and put outside of the State House. I got the worst emails and phone messages from all over. But at the end, and then I was a Democrat and I was willing to work with a Republican governor to get this done. But at the end of the day, it was a decision based on facts, mathematics, and sustaining pensions and benefits for people going forward. So you're absolutely right. That Rutgers decision and that pension and benefit decision were the two challenges that made me step out of a lane that people thought I should remain in the lane, but I have never regretted those decisions.
Now we want to open it up to some Q&A. Amy?
Thank you. Before we begin the Q&A, we're going to launch a polling question so all of you get the CEU credits that you are earning by watching this session. This question is needed to mark your attendance at the session and get your credit purposes. If you're viewing the presentation in full screen model, I ask that you exit the full screen so you can see the menu bar above the chat box feature on your right-hand side. On that menu bar, you will see a tab on the far right titled Polling, which you will need to click on to view the polling question. The polling question is only available for a limited time, and you must answer that question before it expires. Please note that there is no submit button. Simply select your answer, and your response will be recorded. Also, please note that there is no penalty for an incorrect answer. The question is now open. If your question box, poll box have frozen, please refresh your screen. This should allow you to answer the question. If you are still not able to answer your question after this, don't worry. We are tracking you in other ways and you will receive credit. Thank you. And while we're answering the poll, I'll ask the first question. It is from George Cook III. Do any of you believe that moral and political courage can be one and the same, or are they two different things entirely?
I think it depends on the circumstance, to be honest. You know, what kind of situation one is in, and if the political situation aligns with your moral compass, then hey, that's a great day. It's an easier day than the other days, I would think.
I agree with that. Yeah. And the questioner is trying to make a determination if political courage can be aligned with world political courage. Would you repeat what the questioner is trying to define?
Certainly. He asks, do any of you believe that moral and political courage can be one and the same, or are they two different things entirely?
I think that moral and political courage can be one and the same. I do believe that. And I think it's going to be your value system, your ethical framework that's going to determine the political courage that you're going to have. But I do believe that it is possible to possess both political and moral courage.
Question?
Okay, Joseph Hale asks, can someone speak to the protections under the Whistleblower Act? Many employees see unethical or inappropriate behaviors on the local, county, and state level, but stay silent due to fear of retribution or losing their jobs. They want to do the right thing, but they need their paychecks.
Well, of course, I've seen a lot of that during, my experience working in municipal government, county government, state government, and working within nonprofit organizations around the state. So certainly I understand the question. And that is why I believe that we have enacted a whistleblower legislation in New Jersey. And I think that is also the reason there are federal protections for that as well. I know that many people in our state, through the years I've worked in the public sector, have reached out to me with those issues when they have not had them addressed within the environment in which they work. And when I receive those types of inquiries, or I receive that type of information, I make certain that I turn it over to the appropriate authority where it belongs. I don't try to cover it up. I don't try to give anybody a heads up. And I think that that is something that should be incumbent upon all of us. I do know the threat that exists. And I do know that many people who have come forward within their work environments have to face retribution, retaliation, and efforts to push them out of their jobs. But I think that people should understand there is protection right in our Attorney General's office. As John Farmer knows, we have a civil rights division, and we've got other entities within our civil liberties framework. You should not have fear. And there are a number of citizen advocacy programs, social justice organizations around our state in New Jersey that would readily stand up with you to provide defense for you if you are combated with, retaliatory kinds of tactics. But I totally understand that people have to, support their families and pay their bills, and for those reasons don't come forward.
Yeah, whistleblower protections are pretty robust, and I think need to be better publicized that they're available. But nothing can completely remove the anxiety that people have coming forward, because they're not just afraid of losing this job, but of not being able to get the next one, and of being stigmatized, as someone who's a complainer or whatever. So I totally understand the anxiety, but the protections that are in place are pretty robust, and maybe the league, can publicize those for its members. Next question.
Okay. Marlena Schmidt asks, what is your perspective about the future of democratic values and the core principles of the U.S. Constitution?
As a historian of the United States, I sort of marvel at the longevity and the integrity of our founding documents, flawed as they are. They are flawed documents, but written by humans. They're going to be flawed. What I find, when a handful of years ago, people were talking about the rise of fascism in the United States, my historian's long view is like, let's be patient. Demagogues have come and gone. Democracy is fine. I found myself actually quite worrying about the state of the democracy, the integrity of the democracy in the last couple of months, and certainly to this present day, because of the attack on fundamental values from many different corners of that are pillars of this democratic republic. So I'm concerned. I'm hoping rational heads will persevere. The rule of law will persevere. But I am concerned. I do think we're going to be coming out on the other side of this okay, and we're living through a challenging era. But I'd be lying if I said that the language of democracy being under attack is hyperbole. I don't think it's hyperbolic at all right now. I really don't. I'm just choosing to be optimistic that rational actors who believe in the rule of law will win out.
And I'd just like to comment that, yes, a document that was written in the 1700s, our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, probably the best document that has ever been authored in any country around the world. But I think it's important to understand that it's a living and breathing document. And we rely upon our judiciary and our Supreme Court to make interpretations of that. But I think it's important for us living in the United States and being citizens in this country to know that there's a responsibility in being a United States citizen, and that is civic engagement. We cannot permit vocal minorities to create circumstances that are going to effectuate the broader part of our American society. And everyone has a role to play in preserving this democracy. I do believe that we will preserve democracy in the United States, but we'll be able to effectively do that. We begin to really hold people accountable for the civic engagement that they must provide. They are also part of the decision-making that happens in the United States.
I just want to add my enthusiastic endorsement of what the Lieutenant Governor just said. Civic engagement is at a critical level of crisis, and institutions have to find ways to inspire our citizens to be better citizens. I think universities are responsible for that work too, and need to find ways to improve the civic education of our students.
We have time for one more question.
Excellent. Sure. Councilwoman Rhonda Wardlow Hurley of Lawnside asks, as elected officials, we are definitely held to a higher standard, but people tend to forget we are human. We do make mistakes. But in such uncertain times, the public health emergency with the pandemic and the nasty political environment, do you feel that there will be a healing or bridging of the gap across party lines? And where do we begin? Thank you.
You know, recently I did a webinar for the League of Women Voters in New Jersey. And one of the things that I discussed during the webinar was this issue of, quote, partisan divide. And will we ever be able, as two dominant political parties, begin to work together and, you know, not characterize one party or the other as the enemy? I think that we are able to do that. As a very pronounced and, you know, dominant Democrat, I have always been able to develop working relationships with Republicans and with independents and with those who belong to other third types of parties that they have formed. I think that it is important. I think that we will return to a space where we can do these things in a bipartisan fashion. It's incumbent upon us. And those of us that are in elected positions, we are not doing a service to our constituents that have elected us if we are not willing to engage, quote, with the other side of the aisle. I think that gets to be extremely important. I think, unfortunately, that's the environment that we're in. We see it at work every day when we watch our cable news stations. I do believe that that eventually is going to go away and subside, but it is political courage and it is good leadership that's going to make that happen. We do not need to have demagoguery involved in our governance in this country, and particularly not in New Jersey. I know as Speaker, I worked very well, even though, you know, the Democratic caucus outnumbered the Republican caucus, but I always took into account the views of those that were on the other side of the aisle. And I think that is extremely important. And I think that there should not be retaliatory action taken against someone that is not of your political persuasion because you don't agree with them or they don't agree with you. But I do believe we will get to a healing. I absolutely do.
Before I throw it to President Holloway for the final comments, it's the last word. I just would note that I've always thought of Rutgers as New Jersey writ small, or New Jersey as Rutgers writ large. And I think what we have today and the two statewide leaders is evidence that both are in very good hands. And having said that, Jonathan, you have the last word.
Thank you. So you give the guy who's been in New Jersey 4 months the last word. That's a very curious decision. I just want to emphasize what the Lieutenant Governor said. I would like to get to a point where we wake up in the morning as Americans, not as a Democrat, or as a Republican, or as a socialist or a progressive, whatever. This is not, I'm not criticizing any particular party. We need a healthy, robust range of parties. But I want us to wake up and recognize that we share more in common than we don't. And if we can start there, if you start the day with that orientation, you come out in a different place. The nature of your disagreements are different. We should have disagreements. That's healthy. That's what a democracy is all about. That's how you find out what the best ideas are. But if you start from the place of sharing as common sensibility, it changes the nature of the disagreement. That's where we need to get to.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Really, thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Sheila, and John Weingart, as always. I've enjoyed it very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.